Justin Mayers, who is a veteran tech entrepreneur and the co-author of a new book called Traction, which I'm really excited to share with you guys because it's all about how startups actually get customers, which is pretty much the defining factor of any new business, as Justin can tell us more about. So Justin, can you just maybe share a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I basically have gone through a couple different startups. One that I co-founded, one of the two that I co-founded in college was acquired. It was like a 3D printing startup. Another that I started also in college was total bust. And then after that, and most recently, I was running growth, so like head of marketing and sales for a developer tools SaaS company called Exceptional Cloud Services that Rackspace acquired for like roughly 8 figures in early 2013. So,
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So, given that track record, you clearly know a thing or two about building revenue and getting customers and getting new businesses. So, traction is sort of, within the venture world these days, has become the buzzword, right? That's certainly what all, especially seed stage investors, are really focused on seeing for web startups and later stage investors as well. But it's been a really central concept in the past few years within the startup world. Can you tell us a little bit about why traction is so important?
Yeah, so I mean, traction is incredibly important because one, it shows that you have a meaningful or viable business in some way. But secondly, I mean, it's about the only way an investor or someone can de-risk their investment. Like, it is a much different proposition investing in a company that's just growing like crazy versus your standard, like, oh, we have this idea or we have this beta product, but no one has used it. We don't have any sort of engagement, growth, or revenue numbers. That's like about as risky as you can get. Traction is the only metric that essentially de-risks that, outside of like, unless you're building like a cancer treatment and it's like, oh, our trials actually worked or whatever. Like, you may not need traction there. It's just like, if the shit works, it's going to be a big business. But for most like web software, most companies in general, honestly, traction is the biggest way to differentiate you from the rest of the companies that are all trying to raise the same money.
And when investors are looking for traction, does it look different than it did 10 years ago?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, if like Instagram, when they raised their, I think it was their Series B, they had something like 5 million users. If you had that in 10 years ago, that's like a large chunk of the entire internet. You know what I mean? Today, that's like a very promising start, and it gives you the idea that maybe this company can scale to like 50, 100 million users. So it's definitely a moving benchmark.
Yeah, and maybe you can share what recently. They were saying how even like last year versus this year, the numbers that they would see as impressive in terms of uptake have grown substantially for consumer-facing web products. Do you have a beat on that or a thought on that?
Yeah, so it's really hard. I mean, consumer-facing web products can be all kinds of things. Like Product Hunt just raised like $6 million. They have incredible traction, but they have traction within like a very small, meaningful subgroup of people within tech and startups who care about new products. On the other hand, so like Product Hunt's traction is going to be evaluated very differently than the traction of the latest and greatest photo sharing app or something like that. So it's really hard to say, but in general, like, I know that a couple of friends in venture look at like week-on-week growth rates, and keeping those above like 5 to 7% is almost always a really good sign.
Makes sense. So I guess that gets us down to the nuts and bolts, right? Everyone wants traction. So how do you actually get it?
Yeah. So like it's kind of interesting. Like, I think when you talk to a lot of people, so before I dive into that, the answer to start with is basically focus on it and take it seriously. And then, which sounds kind of stupid, like you would be like, why would you need to tell me that? But if you're starting a company or running a company, I can almost guarantee that if I asked you, like, what is on your product roadmap? What do you have coming up over the next 6 months to a year that you're going to build? You would have like, oh, we're going to build this feature, and we're going to roll this out, and it's going to be awesome. And then if I said the same thing about traction or marketing, like, what are you planning on doing to go from 10,000 to 50,000 customers? You would have very little idea, or most people would have very little idea, and they would just be like, we'll blog, or we'll buy AdWords, or something like that, Like, it's just not as well thought through. And so what we talk about in the book is basically we give you a framework that a lot of successful startups are using, kind of like people use the lean startup or other similar product development methodologies when building products. We offer what we call the bullseye framework that helps you figure out, what traction channels make sense for your business, and then determine which ones will actually be the one or two that lead to massive growth for your company.
Is finding traction and growth hacking the same thing?
So I would say that traction is kind of a earlier stage. So I would say traction encompasses more. So I would say that like traction is the process of figuring out what channels work for you and then optimizing those channels to get traction, to get growth. Growth hacking, in my opinion, if you look at it, is often figuring out the growth and optimization hacks for one specific channel and doubling down on those.
Got it. Okay, so you and your co-author interviewed more than 40 some really well-known tech entrepreneurs in order to inform this book. When you interviewed them, what were the sort of the most counterintuitive findings that you came across? What surprised you?
Yeah, so what surprised me was how different and how varied all of the traction channels that they used were to get traction. Like, it was just kind of amazing. Like, I knew this at a certain level, but it was just really surprising to see, oh, we multi-billion-dollar companies, and they all, which is just fascinating to me,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, sort of going to the reverse of that, you've had quite a bit of experience building traction for the companies you've been involved in. What's the biggest mistake you've made?
A lot, but let's see. So I mean, outside of traction, like I've made big hiring mistakes and stuff like that, but more traction related, I think one of the mistakes that I made early on was just starting out and thinking like, there's like a silver bullet in here somewhere, and I'm going to try and find that silver bullet. So I like tested a bunch of different things, and I was like, oh, content marketing, that's working well, but it's not driving, like, it's not like blowing us up yet. And so I just never really, for too long of a stretch, I was basically testing different channels and not focusing on optimizing the one or two that had really promising signals. And I was just thinking like, I'm going to find that silver bullet. There's a silver bullet somewhere, rather than just focusing on like, okay, this channel is promising, it's working, how can I optimize it and get the most growth, most traction out of it that I can, and then move on to other channels to see like what I can do there.
And what were those signals?
So with content marketing, for example, we put out some really interesting content, did really well, had really great implications for SEO, we got shared a lot, got a lot of new trial signups, but it wasn't enough, and they weren't paying us immediately. And so I stupidly, like, we had like 100 points on Hacker News. We had like 40,000 people visit this article. We got several thousand people join our email list from that. And not all of them paid us right away, obviously. And because of that, I was like, oh, these people aren't going to pay us right away, so let's move on to something else. When instead, that's like a very clear signal that the content we're using, the content we were writing about was working. It was attracting people, and if I had invested more time, which I did later, but I should have done it right away, in building out like email conversion funnels, doing all of this kind of stuff to move them towards a purchase, that I think would have been a really, really strong channel that we would have learned about far earlier than we did.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And when you look at other entrepreneurs out there and talk to them, what's the biggest mistake you see others make?
Yeah, so partially it's not focusing on traction at all. And then the other part of it is just not really being creative or going all in. Like I see a lot of companies and a lot of people doing like $100 of AdWords, $100 of Facebook ads, $100 of Twitter ads, one crappy blog post a week, and just like they're not putting their efforts into any one channel, and thus don't see any growth, like any major growth from any one channel. You know, like if Facebook ads work, you should be doubling down on that channel and ignoring pretty much everything else until you bring every bit of traction you can out of Facebook ads. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so again, you interviewed some top folks for this book. So if Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia and Alexis Ohanian from Reddit had a traction competition, what would that fight look like, and who would win? And you can pick other, if you want to do Noah Kagan versus Andrew Chen, or go for it. But,
so it's interesting. I think that, it's hard to say. I think that they would, so they both kind of did similar things, like they built communities, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in today's world, if they were to do it today, I think Alexis would do a better job, but that is not reflective at all of like the fact that Jimmy Wales is bad at this stuff. Like he built one of the world's biggest communities, and he just did it. You know, he just happened to have an incredibly ambitious idea, and did an amazing job building the community at a time when the resource like Wikipedia didn't exist. You know, so I would say it would be a close one. But yeah, I mean, they're both very, very incredible community builders, incredible at rallying people to care about and spend time and energy focusing on the cause that they are promoting, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so why don't we take a little bit of a different tack? You know, your co-author was Gabriel, who's the founder and CEO of DuckDuckGo, the search engine that doesn't track your data. And what was the creative process you guys took for writing the book itself? Because it's a product too, right?
Yeah. So we did a couple things. So we had a chapter outline. Every chapter we outlined. I would send it to Gabe. He would send it back. We would do high-level revisions. I would go away, write most of it, and then we'd do another round of edits, send it to our editor. He would send it back. We would do another round of edits, and then it would finally be done. So it was a long process, but it was fantastic.
How long did it take?
Overall, it took about 20 months to get everything done. So obviously not full-time, but still, it's a very long process.
And you've worked in many tech companies, so did you notice any similarities between the actual creative process of writing the book and then the creative process behind building a new product?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I was going to say that we did is we had some of these ideas, which you can find earlier in the book, the bullseye framework, the critical path, 50% rule, all these things we talk about. They are things that we talked about, heard other founders telling us about, and then tested by having Gabe write a short blog post on them. And then we said, you know, how does this blog post resonate with Gabe's audience? What do people think of it? You know, where can this be improved? And so one of the early things that we changed is early on in the book, we were going to call every traction channel traction verticals. We didn't have a name for the bullseye framework. It was just like the traction framework. People were like, no, you need to brand this. Like, I just keep forgetting what it is. And traction framework, someone else will say they have a new traction framework, and it's not definitive. You know what I mean? So there were a lot of improvements that we made that I think made the book a lot better, from getting feedback from Gabe's readers and just the two of us like hashing these things out. But in terms of building a tech product, yeah, tons of similarities. I mean, we came with kind of a very basic version. Then we exposed it to people, you know, and said, like, what do you think of this? Does it accomplish our objectives? Based on feedback, we changed it and then released like a better, more improved version. You know, that is almost the epitome of software development and building software products.
Are there any other lessons that you've learned as an entrepreneur that you found were really relevant to being an author, or vice versa? Have you learned anything from writing and producing?
Yeah, so I found that I am terrible at estimating how long it'll take to get things done. That was one big lesson I learned. But more seriously, I think that I realized just how important it is to work with someone else that you respect and you think is like very smart and can help you get things done. This book just it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Gabe and I working together. Like, he tried to do it in the past on his own. I had tried to write stuff on my own before, and just without the accountability, without someone else to bounce ideas off of, it never would have gotten done.
Makes sense. So let's take this analog one step further. You just published a book about finding traction, and I assume that part of what you and Gabe are doing right now is trying to find traction for your book, right? So are you applying the lessons from the book to launching the book?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we applied them a lot, especially around our launch week, where we focused on a bunch of communities where startup people and marketers hang out. I think we did a great job of owning almost every community that we wanted to hit. And, we're like in the top 0.5% of books published in terms of our first month sales, which is
wow.
Yeah, which is really awesome.
Are you comfortable sharing those numbers? Like, what does that mean to
so basically we sold like over 10,000 copies, which puts us in very, very rarefied air for self-published authors.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's really cool, and like we have a bunch of cool things that are coming shortly. But essentially, I think like our traction strategy worked. We were going to focus on communities where marketers and startup people hung out, and then leverage large email lists and blog followings and podcasts to basically get the word out, all within a 2 to 4 week window of the book launch.
Got it. Makes sense.
So that was the strategy from the start, and like we messed up some things, but overall, I think it worked out really well, and I'm really happy with how launch went.
Is there anything that so I think when anybody's launching a book, there are always mistakes or things that don't work out quite as well, right?
Yeah.
But was there anything that worked that sort of surprised you that worked particularly well?
Podcasts are amazing.
Oh, okay. Why?
I am just stunned at how much better podcasts work for us than guest posting.
Interesting.
Stunned. Yeah.
And do you know why? Like, or do you have a guess? Like,
I don't know why. I have theories, but I think that the main reason is because if I think about the way I consume blog content, there's so much of it. It's generally swipe through my dig reader or just look around on the internet, click on an article, skim through it, and then archive it. If it's like really amazing, maybe I'll refer to it and read it later. But it's basically like 2 to 3 minutes of time maybe per piece of content,
Sure.
Whereas with a podcast, that is a audio medium. I will consume podcasts for 20 to 60 minutes, and I generally feel like I have more of a relationship with whoever's running the podcast. So I think that I can sell you on the ideas behind Traction Book and the concepts behind Traction Book a lot better through a 60-minute talk than I can by writing a blog post that, even though it may have taken me 3 hours to write, you're going to consume in 4 minutes. You know what I mean?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so I just think that that's a very powerful medium, that if I listen to some guy talk about traction for an hour, and this is something I'm struggling with, I am probably far more likely to read that book or buy that book or be interested in it than I am if I was just to read one blog post about a framework within the book that I'm like, oh, that sounds neat, but I have other things to do today.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess, potential readers are investing their time a priori, so they're already making the decision to, spend at least 30 minutes with you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
I actually think podcasting is a really interesting space right now. In addition to sort of everyone starting their own podcast, including me, I mean, the audio will be scraped for a podcast. There have been some really interesting new ones recently. Did you hear that? Do you listen to This American Life on NPR by any chance?
I don't, no.
So they're obviously a major national radio show, right? But one of their producers just quit to start a podcasting company. And he has a great clip where he actually recorded his pitch to Chris Sacca of
Really?
Capital. And it's hilarious. Like, it's great. So you should check it out.
I'll check that out. That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
What's this podcast called?
I think it's actually called Startup. And it was featured on a This American Life podcast, and the show itself was called "It's the Person, Not the Product."
Awesome.
I can send you a link. That's great.
That would be amazing.
The other really interesting one that I've heard recently that is a little different is a show called Serial, S-E-R, I guess I-A-L, Serial, like a serial novel. And it's actually an investigative reporter who is, like every week there's a new episode where she's going back and investigating a cold case murder from like 10 years ago. And like, yeah, I mean, it's like fascinating. And like, she really, anyway, I'll send you a link to both. I think that there's a lot.
Please do. Those sound awesome. I'm actually thinking of starting my own as well, so we'll have to chat about that at some point.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. Well, I guess last question. What important questions am I not asking?
It depends what you want out of the interview. But, the things that we could talk about are, how do you actually go about applying the Bullseye framework? Like, how do you run small tests to determine what channels make sense for your business? What channels make some sense for a certain type of business versus others?
Okay, so let's, in the book you go over 19 different channels, and I know that for many entrepreneurs who are working very hard on just getting a product out and awesome, right? I'm sure that evaluating, experimenting with, selecting, and optimizing for 19 channels could be like such a psychologically overwhelming task that they might just pass on the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Which could be a big mistake. So how do you get started? How do you go from 0 to 1?
Yeah, so we talk about this in the book, but it's essentially using the Bullseye framework. So we do not want you testing all 19 channels. Literally, the purpose of the book is we want someone to read it, buy into the fact that if you can acquire customers in a way that your competitors aren't, aka if you can use a traction channel that no one else in your market is using, that can be a huge advantage. Mm-hmm. And then after that, we do literally, we have the 19 chapters on each of the channels, which may sound like it's a lot, but in reality, you can read through that section in an hour and a half. And after an hour and a half, you will know every channel out there, the tactics that work in those channels, and then make a reasonably effective guess at what channels might work for your business, like given what numbers you're trying to hit, given your average revenue per customer, all that kind of stuff. And so after looking at these channels and evaluating them, the goal is to get to 3 to 5 that you think have a chance of working, ranking them in terms of which ones you think are most effective in terms of time, potential output, cost per channel, and then running tests in like the 1 or 2 channels that you think are most promising. So throughout this whole process, it's basically 19, 3, and then like 1 test that you're running on a channel.
Got it. And maybe can you walk us through an example of 1 channel, a test you could run, and how you'd make a decision on optimization after getting the results?
Yeah, so content marketing is a great one. We get asked a lot. People say, how do I test content marketing? I think that the answer is you spend a ton of time, write the best post you could imagine you could ever write, and then put it out there. So publish it on your blog, promote it to Reddit, Hacker News, StumbleUpon, buy Facebook ads, buy Twitter ads, a little bit just to give you a social boost. Spend money on a Outbrain type or share through type deal, so get it syndicated. And after putting in $100 to $500, doing your best to promote this and writing the best piece of content you can, see what that content drives in terms of customers, email signups, all of this stuff to your product. If it makes no difference, you can pretty safely say content marketing is going to be a tough channel for us to get working because we put out our best stuff and it didn't work. You know what I mean? And so I think if you just think about that lens, what's the best thing we can do in this channel? Test that. If it doesn't work, then move on to the second most promising thing in your rankings.
Makes sense. No, that's great. That's great. Okay, so now Traction, the book is out. Your launch, 2 to 4 week launch window was a success. What's next for you?
So for starting on Thursday, I am traveling Europe for about 3 weeks, doing a couple talks around traction and like also just traveling. So that'll be fun. But after that, I am working on my own company, which I will have more info about shortly. So it'll be good, but I'm definitely doing my own company now.
Wonderful. Well, looking forward to hearing more about it and to hearing about your misadventures in Europe.
Thanks, man.
Where can people find you online?
I'm at justinmares.com. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter. I don't tweet that much, but JWMares. But yeah, definitely follow me on my blog. That's probably the best place to learn more about me, see some of the stuff I think about, and all of that.
Perfect. Well, Justin, thanks so much for being on the show today. And for all our listeners out there, you can find traction pretty much anywhere. Amazon's super easy, but there's a landing page for the book, and if you want to get more customers for your startup, it's a really good place to start. So again, thank you so much.
Yeah, I will say if they go to tractionbook.com, they can download the first 3 chapters for free. So if you want to check it out, see if I'm a snake oil salesman.
Definitely.
Go for that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks again, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Bye.